I'm Adrienne Giffen, and this is Now You're Talking. Parenting in the digital world can feel overwhelming, especially when you're balancing a career, raising teens and preteens, and trying to keep up with it all. Screens are constant, and sometimes real connection feels out of reach. This podcast is your chance to pause and breathe, a space for stories and insights that bring encouragement, perspective, and the reminder that you are not alone. Parenting and teaching in today's digital world can feel like walking a tightrope. We're trying to stay connected while everything around us speeds up. In this episode, I sit down with Elizabeth Bennett, an educator with over 35 years of experience, and the author of Courageous Conversations. Elizabeth shares how curiosity, compassion, and communication can bridge the growing gap between parents, teens, and educators. We talk about why so many kids feel unheard, how digital noise fuels disconnection, and how we can all learn to listen with understanding instead of judgment. Elizabeth's insights remind us that presence, not perfection, is what helps families and classrooms thrive. If ever you've wondered how to create more meaningful conversations with the young people in your life, this episode's for you. Let the conversations begin. Elizabeth, tell me about you and
Well, I come from the field of education. I was in the field of education for over 35 years. And I retired several years ago as a school principal because I was done with that part of it. However, I wrote a book called Courageous Conversations, a guide for parents to understand and connect with their teens. Because that's really a disconnect. You know, kids don't feel heard. They don't feel valued. They don't feel like anybody listens to them. They don't even know, in some cases, whether they have purpose or not. Oftentimes, they're at wit's end with their parents and they yell and scream at each other and then off they go. Up goes the hoodie, in goes the earbuds, out comes the cell phone, and they're out of there. And so parents have a difficult time as well trying to figure out how to engage, what to say, what to do, right?
Yes.
But what I notice with that, though, is that those kids now are in business and industry, and they don't know how to have conversation there either. Well, because the things that I also saw in education, bullying is rampant, mental health concerns are through the roof, social isolation is on the increase. Those things are also happening in workplaces. More and more often, I see things on LinkedIn, particularly where we're talking about toxic environments and people not, well, because they don't feel heard, they don't feel listened to, they don't feel valued, they don't feel appreciated, right? And the sort of things are showing up there. And often what I say when I'm working with people in business and industry is that we have a collective PhD in avoidance because we don't like to have conversation because we feel that every time we have a conversation, it's a conflict or it's I don't like to be confrontational. This is not about confrontation. This is about invitation.
Yeah, I like that. That's so fantastic. Yes. So tell me, so you were a principal. So you saw it all. You saw the business of education being at that top position and then all the political stuff around it. So what are you doing now to sort of balance that or to fulfill a need?
Well, actually, what I'm trying to do now is to go back into, because when you're in education, you don't think of it as a business. You're thinking, you're dealing with students and parents and activities and, school functions and all that other stuff. And I didn't ever think of it as a business. But now that I've stepped away from that, and from time to time, I will, go back to schools to have conversation with parents to help them see what's going on. Because I could talk all day on that. But the piece that I'm doing now with business and industry is I'm trying to get into, or I'm making my efforts to get into school districts to now have conversations with principals. Because and certainly in my experience, principals are typically teachers to begin with. So in the school district I was in, I was a teacher first, And then, I applied as an assistant principal. And so you're basically, you're almost 80% in the classroom, and you're doing the odd and end thing about, what a playground issue or so on.
Yeah.
I was in that position for a while and gathered more information and skills and understanding and so on. And then I applied into being a vice principal, and same thing. I was still teaching and doing that. And then again, when I did the same thing in order to get into principalhood, I chose to stay in the teaching piece so that I could see what was going on in classrooms and having conversations with kids and finding out more about what's going on.
Interesting. So you stayed on the front line, really?
Yeah. But what I noticed with that, though, is that although we can move from one position to the next, we are often focused mostly on curricular things. So if the government is coming in with something new, that we have to talk about it, figure out how we're going to roll it out, what we're going to do with teachers, the resources, and all those other things. Or we're talking about, the newest book and the newest way to do something.
Yeah.
Right? Because every year, and I'm still, again, only referring to my own school district, where we would have a guest speaker, and that book would be what we would use that year. And we would have conversation during because our principals would meet once a month, and we would have a staff meeting with principals and directors and superintendents. So we would have those kinds of conversations, and then be able to take that information and take it back to your school and, have things work in school. But one of the things that I noticed, though, was that we rarely had workshops or any kind of meetings where we were talking about how do we connect? How do we establish relationship? How do we do whatever, right?
Yes.
So you're left basically to your own devices in terms of how you deal with things. And so that's when I began to notice things. And we even do it as partners or colleagues in workplaces, right? We sort of, that's what Adrienne's like. Never mind, she'll be fine.
Yeah.
Rather than saying, so I've noticed that, you've looked a little sad these past couple of days, or you haven't been your bright, shining self.
Yeah.
So what's going on? Is there something I can do to help support you, right? Doesn't cost anything. In fact, it might end up saving your life, because in some cases it has happened that has been the very thing that has saved someone from going home and shooting themselves or doing whatever. So, it's not my intention for people to be therapists. It's my intention to have people have real, powerful, connected conversations.
Yeah. Wow. This is music to my ears. It really is. I see the world from being a parent and a grandparent and how the world has changed. But it's so fascinating to talk with you about because you've seen it all. You've seen the evolution of education, really. And what you're saying to me is that it really is about getting back to the basics.
Mm-hmm.
But we've got to relearn those basics in a way.
Well, we don't have to beat ourselves up over it. We can just start today, right?
Yeah.
Because we are talented in that regard.
Yes.
It's easy for us to beat ourselves up and shame and guilt and blame and all that stuff. I'm not talking about any of that. What I talk about with folks, and I have 5 strategies of dedicated listening that I use. So the first strategy is understanding versus judgment. So please understand what's going on for that other person, whether it's your child or whether it's a colleague or whether it's your partner, right?
Yes.
To really get to being curiously engaged about what's going on for them.
Yes.
Because if we don't, because any type of behavior is a form of communication.
Yeah. The 96% of things that we don't say.
Right.
Yeah. But nonverbal.
Right? But we show them with our facial expressions or our body language, or we don't look at the other person, or we mumble, or we avoid, because that's what I said about, having a PhD in avoidance. We just avoid it, hoping like hell it'll go away, right? Yeah. Rather than stepping into it and saying, look at, and part of that is, as part of the 5 strategies, is being able to come back over here and take a look at how we're showing up in that conversation, and that we need to take responsibility for where we are and say it. So, and that's what I mean about, starting right now. So if I'm having a particular, let's say, for example, I just yelled at you, right? There was something going on today. I was caught up in a bunch of stuff. I was out and somebody cut me off or whatever, right? And you and I begin to have a conversation or I just blast you for something. And then I say, oh my God, I'm so sorry, Adrienne, because that wasn't remotely about you. That was something that happened to me. And I mean, I don't need to get into the whole song and dance about it, but I could say that, my God, this happened today. I'm up to my eyeballs. I apologize. That was not meant for you. Now I also say, but I understand that there was an impact with you. So now I'm recognizing you too and saying, how can we fix this? How can we do something in order for this not to happen? Or can we start again?
Yes.
Conversation, right?
Yes. And so that when you were saying that, I mean, that's about having that conscious relationship. And I've read lots of stuff in relationships, like our partners, so true in every interaction that we have. It's figuring out what happens when people trigger us. And that is a ripple effect to trigger somebody else. And so to acknowledge that is huge.
And in both ways, right? I have done this and I'm, going to say whatever it is I'm going to say about how I have just shown up for you, and at the same time acknowledging you and the impact that it could have on you.
Yes. Boy, that takes a lot of emotional intelligence to be able to even recognize that whatever just happened was a trigger and was more about ourselves than it was about the other person.
And, it could be something as simple. So, for people who might end up listening to your podcast, or, it could be something that happens in your house. So you might have been yelling at your partner or your child or whatever because they keep leaving their mug right on top of the dishwasher. Why can't they put it in there, right? And you keep saying, yelling at them and so on, can't you put it away? And then finally, let's have a conversation about this. So I get that I continue to yell at you, and it hurts my heart that I do that because I get so frustrated. And I bet for you, it's equally as annoying because you don't want to be yelled at, and that it probably, my guess is, that it might hurt your feelings too.
Yes.
Can we do differently that this doesn't need to happen?
Yes, yeah.
Right, and then there's another opening for conversation there. Well, I probably could put my mug in the dishwasher. Hallelujah. You don't say that out loud, but, you're cheerful and joyful of the whole idea that maybe they've come up with a solution, right? But that's what it is. It's that invitation to see what can we do differently and how could this work differently?
Yeah, in every level. When you talked about curiosity, and now I like curiosity because it's something that comes from, right? It gets rid of the judgment. If we're curious, it's not like we're judgy. I don't know, and I'm not, yeah, but so the verse is understanding, and so how do you just label what we just talked about, that triggering, or is that your number two?
Well, I don't have them in any particular order. I just usually start with the understanding versus judgment, because then I go into a space where I talk about intentional time and how it's very critical for us to have intentional time, and particularly with our kids. However, in the workplace, I use the example of, turning around, like, if you're at your desk and you're sort of doing this and you're here and the person that you're speaking to is over there, and you still be over here. It's about stopping this, and it's about turning and facing. And I get that we have cultural things about people looking at each other in the eyes and so on. I get that piece. However, it needs to be a place where there aren't any distractions. So I'm going to turn off my screen, or I'm going to shut my laptop, or I'm going to put my phone over here and I'm not going to answer it, or I'm going to put it on silent for a moment while we're having this conversation. Because that's important too, because that's the space of value. That's the space of being heard. That's the space of being listened to.
Yeah.
All of those things are critical because we don't do that.
No, and we don't model them for
Right. So then nobody else knows that that's what they should be doing.
Yes, yeah.
And how do you feel? How does it make you feel when somebody actually does that?
Yeah, it's almost unique now, isn't it? Somebody turns over their phone or says, oh, no, I'm not going to take this call because you're important. This conversation is important. And I want you to keep telling me about this. I find it fascinating. How, as a principal, and you saw the evolution of digital, how did you deal with that?
In one of my schools that I was in, because we don't typically get a choice of where we go. We're typically placed when God is in need, right? Or the new year is coming up and people are retiring, whatever the case may be. Anyway, in this particular school, we've been having some issues with cell phones particularly. And, there would be days where, teachers would get really frustrated or so on. Well, we had two camps in that. We had a couple of teachers who were very gifted at social media or at using their cell phones to play Jeopardy or there was all kinds of names of things, right, where kids could do polls and, so there was an engagement piece, but not everybody was like that. Not everybody has those gifts and talents. And so I'm just going to give you that as part of the context. But what was happening was I was getting more and more cell phones on my desk. Teachers were, because we had gone through a whole series of things that we tried. Those shoe rack things that hang on the back of your door.
Yeah.
Well, for a period of time, kids would put their cell phones in there, and they'd pick them up at the end of class. Then that didn't work out particularly well because we were concerned about the whole idea that, you might like the iPhone 14 as opposed to the iPhone 8 that you currently own, right? So we were concerned about that. So then we got things like little Tupperware buckets, and then the phones would be put in that and they'd be put on the teacher's desk. Well, same kind of issues where, you can't monitor, and we as teachers don't know who belongs to every phone unless you put your name on it, right? And that wasn't going to happen. So then it got to a point where, we were, and particularly with junior highs, because they're my favorite. So, I'd have some serious conversations with them and say, look, you have the opportunity to have this cell phone. And we had often had our school resource officers come to talk about various things. So the police officer would come and so on. And there was one time that this police officer came and he was explaining the whole idea that parents are really responsible for the cell phone because they pay the bill. They put their name on that dotted line, right? And so should something untoward happen, your parent gets into trouble. And it could be like very serious trouble. And it was also at a time where we were talking with students about being responsible digital citizens. And so we would give them the opportunity to use them in a classroom and so on. And then it began to get out of hand because there would be some days where I would have a bunch of them on my desk, right? And I'd be doing something and one would whir and one would dance and one would this and that. And from time to time, I would pick them up and I would be, sort of shocked that it was a parent, right? And thinking, call the office during the day, for God's sakes, right? So somebody else would whir or buzz or whatever, and I'd pick that up and it would be another kid in that kid's class. So easy for me just to walk down the hallway, say to the kid, look give me your cell phone, you could pick it up at the end of the day, and they'd be mortified or shocked, right? And it's like, well, had you not been texting the other person, I wouldn't have known about it. So we went through all that. Then I decided that I was going to do a survey. So I created a paper survey because we could still use paper. And I sent that home to parents from kids from grade 3 to, in that particular case, I had a school where it was K-9. So no, and that year we didn't have the 9s. They were at another school. So I sent that home from grade 3 all the way to grade 8. I sent another survey to the teachers. I sent a survey to the students and anybody else in the school who was responsible for having connections with kids. Grade 3, 4, and 5 wasn't an issue. And the parents were pretty good about responding and saying, because I asked some pretty straightforward questions about how do you monitor it at home. I was pushing the limits there, but the few that I got back were, a couple of them were as diplomatic as they could be. Grade 6s were the group that gave me the most insight into what was happening, because some of the questions that I asked were things like, do you find that are there some kids in your class who are using their cell phones inappropriately during class? And that was a yes. And then there were some where I gave them places to explain more things. They were concerned about, cybersecurity. They were concerned about bullying online. They were concerned. And so I had lots of content to work with. So then I got to grade 7s and 8s. 7s weren't so bad. In grade 8 class, there was one that was totally accepting. They could understand the bigger picture because some of them had been involved with situations that we had either navigated with the police or with their families or so on. And this other grade 8 class, they had this collective attitude going on. And I said, well, let me give you some information about what's going on. And I said, I can appreciate that you believe that you have the right to have your cell phone. And that's absolutely right. You do have that right. Your parents bought it for you, whatever, they think for your safety or understanding or whatever, or to give you a little bit of responsibility. You have rights and responsibilities. And if you recall in grade 6 social, because I knew that, in your social class, you had government and there were rights and responsibilities. Well, you have the right to have your cell phone. You also have a responsibility to use it well. And considering that has not been happening, and there have been, and I gave them the list of concerns about cyberbullying, about, all kinds of things that were going on. And I said, so for a period of time, we're going to ask that you not have them in class. And here's the first part of what we're going to do about that. You can bring them to school and leave them in your locker. So then there were, a handful of parent concerns about that. And I dealt with those. And I just said, look, this is what's going on. And it's interfering with student learning. And it's not fair. And it's not right. And they're here to do that. And then there were some parents that were saying, oh, thank God. Too bad you didn't, or from time to time prior to sending out that poll, I would have called a couple of parents to say, look, I picked up your son or daughter's cell phone. This has been several times. And they would say, oh, please keep it and I'll pick it up tomorrow. Right.
Right. Yeah.
But then there were some that were just, like I had a parent come in one time and she said she was really, her hair was on fire. And she said, my daughter is being bullied and I want you to do something about it. And we had just had the police officer in. And so I gave her that shorter version of it and said that, parents need to be monitoring. So I didn't say it from me. I said it from him, which was a little bit easier, I think, for her to hear. That it's important for parents to monitor their children's cell phones to see the kinds of activity and the conversations or so. And I said, so that might be something you might consider doing. Maybe that's what you want to do. I wouldn't do that because I gave her that cell phone because I wanted her to have responsibility. I wanted her to have a little bit of independence and so on.
Yeah.
So they're her friend. And so she said, and I want her out of that classroom because this so-called friend is causing all this trouble and so on. And I said, okay. I said, that seems to be a little surprised to me. And these were grade 8 girls, right? Because I see them walking down the hallway. They're draped all over each other. They seem to be having a good time. But here's what I'll do in the meantime before we make that final decision about moving, because I just didn't want to do it in the middle of the year because it changes the dynamics in the classrooms too, right? If these kids are causing trouble. Anyhow, so I got around it by saying that, I'll check with the teachers because, they have 6 or 7 teachers being in junior high. So I'd have conversation with those teachers just to monitor if they're doing group projects or partner projects that please, you just don't have, you can do what you want, say what you want in your class, but just don't have them work together. Then later on, I think probably a day or so, or maybe even that same day, I got a call from the other parent who said, Elizabeth, there's something going on. I'm not really sure. Something's happening with my daughter. Could you just check it out for me? And I said, sure. I said the similar kinds of things. I didn't tell her that I had already been speaking with this other parent, But I said, sure, I'll check it out with the teachers, see if there's anything that more that I need to know about, and I'll certainly share that with you. The following week, the first parent who had come to see me, whose hair was on fire, was now completely, her ears were down a bed, almost like her tail was between her legs and so on. She had had a conversation with her daughter, and she recognized that in the conversations, it was her daughter who was the bully.
Interesting. Yes. And as parents, we never want to see that. So what words of wisdom do you have, knowing what you've been through and what you've seen evolve? What do you have words of wisdom for parents these days?
To start having those conversations.
Yes.
And they're having, it's on the back of my business card that says, step into your conversations with courage. So you need to be, as parents, I encourage them to step out of their comfort zone. And to be a little bit vulnerable and say, look, I don't have all the answers. I want to walk along this path with you. I want to help you out. I'm not trying to be a detective. However, I share that with them, and I say sometimes you need to be a detective. And that's with the curious questions too.
Yeah.
Tell me more about what's going on so that I understand, and then I can help you deal with whatever.
Yes. I've created a board game called Now You're And it starts in high school. And it's a result of my book that I wrote called Unravel You. And it's just because and I'm giving you all sorts of information, but as an executive recruiter, we ask questions to our candidates that start in high school, because we work with a process called top grading that says that things that happen in high school repeat throughout a person's career. Just like you said at the beginning, exactly, people, who they are in high school, repeats into business. So what I'd like to do is ask you some questions off my board game. Now You're Talking. It's
sure, that'd be fun.
Going to manufacturing soon, and it will be available. And it's an actual board game where you go down with adversity and you go up with growth and change, and which is sort of
snakes and ladders.
It's not but it's life. It's life. So, so I am going to take questions out of the impressionable years. Let me just think, because the impressionable years. So I want you to describe, Elizabeth, a high point in your high school.
It wasn't my favorite place.
Not, buddy, yet you've built your career there.
A high point. I think there were a couple of teachers who recognized that I was more capable than I was demonstrating. And so that made me feel good, because it was few and far between where I was actually seen.
See, and that is interesting too. So that connects to why you're saying, have a conversation so these kids can be seen.
Yeah.
And in a way, parents can be seen too.
Yeah.
And that's what my board game Now You're Talking does. It brings the generations together. And I've played with 4 generations, my mom in her 90s and a grandchild who is 6. And it's amazing to have people of different generations talking to one another. Yeah. So what advice would you give your younger high school self?
To step out of our own comfort zone and take risks and be on fire.
That's interesting. And what advice do you give to current graduates?
High school?
Yeah, high school graduates. I'm focusing on that because of where you've come from and where you're going.
Yeah, again, it really is. It's in order to step into their life with courage, to take risks, to try things out. The worst thing that happens is failure is just feedback.
Failure is just feedback. Well, that's great. So that's interesting. So knowing what you know now, what would you do the same, and what would you do differently?
What would I do different? I would do what I just said. Is to take more risks, get out there, step out, and it doesn't matter what other people think or say, because that's the thing that's been holding us all back, right?
So then going back to you and what you're doing now. Mm-hmm. So you've stayed in the system, and now you're going to go out in different ways. So tell us more about that, or tell people who are listening to hear. and how you're going to make a difference now.
Well, the difference that I'm making now is I want to disrupt things. See, because we have become so incredibly positional that we think, and this is like in countries, this is the world at the moment. We are in utter chaos. And the positional space is really, that's only a way of moving forward. There are many other ways. And so it leads me back to the understanding versus judgment. If someone is completely polarized, because that's what we've become, then it's worthy of having that conversation and understanding where that other person or that other country or that other whatever is coming from. Not that you need to agree, but at least if there's something that's common ground where you can move together, because we all want the same thing.
Yes.
We want good health care. We want good education. We want people to be safe. We want homes. We want food for people. We want to get people off the streets. We want a better world for our next generations. Well, if we want that, then we need to start right here, right now, and make a difference.
Yes.
But in part of that, though, because we've lost this art, of the art of listening.
Yes. So it's not only talking, it's sitting back and listening to what the person says and really listening. And that's what you said earlier, is being present. Put your phone away. Don't answer that call.
Right.
Be full.
Well, and the listening piece as well is being able to not regurgitate and not do that therapist kind of, I hear you saying this, and you can say it if you want, but to say back some of what they've said. And if there's a word that you don't understand, if there's a way in which they've said it that's not quite clear, then ask again. So tell me more about that.
Yes.
Help me to really understand what's going on here.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so our conversation has gone full circle, really. I mean, where we started and now here, it's the same thing. Just really listening, be fully present, ask good questions that are curious instead of judgmental, understand when people trigger our some. But what I like too is what you said is not only be aware of that and how it's making you feel, how does then your reaction make the other person feel? And then it keeps going. And it's a way of stopping that process, that ripple effect of one bad reaction, creating many, many more.
Well, and then the other piece of that too is about acknowledgement. And it's reflective acknowledgement in that you can, and there's little like dots underneath. So there's little elements underneath it to say, when you're sharing this with me, what would you like me to do? Do you want me just to listen?
Mm-hmm.
Want me to, come up with a solution for you? Or do you want me to walk along with you and we'll work on something together? So then there's choice too for how you can proceed from there. But then the other part of it is reflective in terms of acknowledging that person for the courage that it took them to share it with you.
And how has that worked for you? Because you deal with all generations. You deal with teachers, you deal with students. How has that worked across the generations for you?
In most cases, it's worked really quite well because people like to be acknowledged. They like to know that what they've said has been heard.
Yes. Yeah.
And that you might not have the answer, but at least you've allowed them to vent, because oftentimes people are not heard.
Yeah.
No one takes the time to listen. And that's what creates more fuss and more anxiety and more fear and more anger. And, if you and something just came to mind. It happened to be at an airport, and this family was ahead of me, and it was at the customer service because something had happened. We couldn't get our flight or something, and they were just going on, and they weren't listening to the person who was saying, "This is the best that I can do for you based on what's going on." Well, you could have done this, and you could have, and then the supervisor came over, and it was like, oh, okay, this could be tense. And the woman who was the customer service person said, "These are the things that I can do for you." And she kept her calm, which was because this family was, and they were all having things to say, right? It was bouncing off one parent to the other. And of course, naturally, the kids are seeing this in action too. And this woman did her, like I would have given her a badge for that, right? For just saying, these are the things that we talked about. These are the connecting flights. Because you could hear it. I mean, we were standing right there, right? And these are the best that we can do for you for now, till this next flight or whatever. Because, I mean, they weren't the only ones that didn't get their flight.
Right. Yes.
But she took the time to listen to what they had said, even though they were, their hair was on fire. She took the time to listen, and you could see that she was truly engaged just with them. And she was taking some notes and trying to listen, and between the two of them, and she asked them to speak one at a time so that she could understand really what was going on, right? And it was, for them, it was chaos and anger and frustration and so on, and they shouldn't have, missed their flight or whatever that was.
And what was the outcome?
Well, the best that they could do at that time was what she provided for them, right?
Okay, so they became calmer and...
Only sort of.
But it's true that if she had come from a different perspective, she could have escalated.
And what was interesting, too, when the supervisor came, the supervisor did not step in, which was very smart. Because it allowed her to be responsible for answering the questions, and it wasn't taken away from her. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
She wasn't diminished because she just continued. The supervisor sort of walked, listened, and just stayed there because we get into these situations and you never know who's going to do what, right? Because we know how chaotic the world is at the moment. Somebody could have pulled a gun or a knife or whatever, right? We don't want to think those things, but unfortunately they are the reality of what happens. So it was interesting from that perspective that client care person wasn't diminished.
Yes. Well, and in fact, empowered.
Yeah.
As that the supervisor stood back and let this person handle it, but was just there in case they needed support. And just in closing, going back to students and the digital era, and parents too, but how from your perspective can we empower students to be the best they can be? So then when they leave high school and university and they go out into the working world, the workplaces are better as a result of them being there.
Well, I mean, that's a multi-leveled answer. We could spend probably another 4 hours on that. I think part of it is that there need to be some boundaries that parents set. And that's a courageous conversation by itself, because what I've noticed through the years of having cell phones is more and more parents are using them too. And they're not, and they're scrolling and they're having conversation with you. Yeah, honey, that's okay. Yeah, you do that. And they're watching TV or Netflix or whatever. And that needs to be something that's modeled for them too, that there needs to be time, whether it's time at a dinner time, because I've certainly been to restaurants often enough to see families sitting there and nobody's having conversation. And I'm thinking, oh my God, it costs a fortune now to go to a restaurant and 5 or 6 of you are sitting around looking at your cell phones. Why did you bother? And so part of that needs to be the space of boundary and to have those conversations and to say, look at, yes, you can. And even as kids are younger, we need to be having those conversations to say, this is your cell phone time, or this is your screen time or whatever, and be firm about that. Yes, they're gonna have their hair on fire for a period of time, but the thing that they'll notice is now they'll do other things. Now maybe they'll get involved with volunteering, or they will, have more family time, because we're missing that too.
Yes. Yeah.
Less and less of that opportunity because we're not making it.
Yes, not as much a priority.
That's right. And isn't that sad? Because And one of the things that I say when I give a talk, particularly to parents, is busy, busy, busy is always going to be there. Your kids might not be, because we're not going to win that war or that game of busyness, where there's always going to be stuff to do. And it was interesting for me as a reflection on my career, is that when I retired, there was somebody else in that spot right away.
Yes. Yeah. That's a good reminder, isn't it? That we're all replaceable, which I don't
Well, some of us actually, but
none of us wants to think that.
there should be a little bit, I don't know, sort of something. I don't know what it is, but it was, wow.
Yeah.
That we are dispensable, right?
Yes. Yeah. But now, Elizabeth, you're on to your next chapter. And I'm beginning of a new era where you're going to be even more courageous and more disruptive. And so now's your time.
Well, and one of my goals is to speak at the UN. So, yeah,
Well,
because I really want to shake it up. I want people to recognize that, and I'm not sure how that's going to work exactly, but...
Well, put it out there, and you just... Yeah. So someone will watch this podcast, and this could be the beginning.
Yoo-hoo, that'd be awesome.
That's
Well, thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Good luck with your game.
Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you for your time.
Well, and I look forward to connecting with you again.
Same here. Same here. If this conversation with Elizabeth Bennett inspired you to slow down, get curious, and truly connect, please share this episode with another parent, teacher, or mentor who's navigating the same challenges. Together, we can help young people feel seen, heard, and valued, and create a future where courageous conversations are the norm, not the exception. You've been listening to Now You're Talking, parenting with a busy career while guiding kids through the lure of screens isn't easy, but meaningful connection is always worth it. Take a moment to start a conversation with someone you care about. It could be the highlight of their day. Until next time, let the conversations begin. Now You're Talking.
I'm Michelle Abraham, and we are honored to have Adrienne Giffen's Now You're Talking podcast on our High Vibe Podcast Network. For more high vibe shows like hers, head on over to highvibepodcastnetwork.com and grab your free gift from our gift vault from all of our hosts. Until then, stay high vibe.